which really, I argue, are nothing more or less than UFO tracking systems in space. And they tracked at exactly the right coordinates at exactly the right time an unknown target directly over Tehran when all of this happened. So it's really a great, solidly documented case. Anyway, moving along through the 1980s, same story. The Peruvian case actually happened in May 9th and 10th, 2 days in a row of 1980, in which a Peruvian pilot was ordered and did, in fact, fire upon a UFO. The following, and the object just took off, gone. He had no opportunity to touch it. The next day, the same event happened again. And in this case, the airbase commander said, "Don't fire," because the weapons were expensive and it had no effect, and he had to explain that. So actually, they didn't fire on it the next day. And on and on and on and on. I mean, the Rendlesham case, everyone probably knows about. Fantastic case, amazing case in 1986 over a large portion of Brazil involving a lot of the Brazilian Air Force. I'll skip the details. You don't really need it at this point. You can read it in my new book when it comes out. Soviet encounters throughout. I mean, when the Soviet Union was in the process of cracking apart, 1989, 1990, 91, that was when, in that country, there was this little window of opportunity, so to speak, in which Soviet people started to talk about this. And what you find in many nations is when you have a regime change, that's when insiders talk. When Franco died in Spain in 1975, immediately after there was a kind of a flurry of Spanish openness on a lot of things, of course, but including UFOs. When Mao died in China the following year, same thing happened. When even going into the United States, our own crisis of Watergate wasn't quite a regime change, but it was close. It was a big crisis, and what did it result in? Passage of a Strengthened Freedom of Information Act, particularly, which was instrumental then in bringing out a tremendous amount of fresh UFO data. And then, of course, in the case of the Soviet Union, where you have a lot of high-ranking ministers and generals saying, yes, absolutely, we have this problem all the time. In fact, one Deputy Minister of Defense, Ivan Tretyak, at the time in 1990, said that he knew of 40 cases offhand where Soviet jets encountered UFOs. Initially, he said they were ordered to try to shoot them down, but we lost too many pilots. They went down. And so the new order became to chase but don't shoot, because there were too many deaths. So evade them, leave them alone. And then the Soviet Colonel Boris Sokolov, who was in charge of a great portion of the Soviet UFO military investigation, said that there were thousands of Soviet cases during the 1980s. In the U.S., I can skip these. There's just more and more. It never stops. The thing that's amazing about this phenomenon is how dense it is, how frequently these jet interceptions actually do occur, and the fact that they get no media portrayal whatsoever. If they were to get the kind of portrayal that they warrant, I think it would absolutely easily dominate. It really would dominate the news. I think there's a great hunger everywhere I go for people in this topic. Typically, they just don't have any knowledge of it. And I think if they were presented with the sheer quantity of incredible, head-scratching UFO encounters, I think they'd be very interested. This one is a very well-known case, it's really just outside of Washington, D.C. in 2002. It's 50 years to the day after some dramatic encounters over D.C. in 1952. In 2002, just outside D.C., in a little suburb called Waldorf, Maryland, a number of witnesses at 1:30 in the morning got out of their homes because they heard the rumbling of F-16 jets going over their houses. Many of them, about half a dozen or so, called in their local radio station and said, well, there's this blue object that they seem to be chasing. One of the witnesses I had the chance to speak to, Rennie Rogers, described it very clearly. He's a government worker. He comes out. He had worked a shift till midnight. He was just watching television. He came out and he saw the jets, and then he saw in this portion of the sky this object come down at an 80-degree angle and stop. Just stop there. little while later, the jets turned around and chased after it and had no chance to get this thing. It just went gone, took off. It's an interesting case because although there's no FOI documentation on this to this day, there was a Washington Post article on it in which they quoted Air Force officials. So we know it happened. And the Air Force, and the Post did the standard he said, she said nonsense to throw cold water on this. So they interviewed Rennie, and then they had this Air Force talking head who said, well, you know, it could have been any number of things. Doesn't say what they could have been. I'd like to know, post 9/11, what kinds of blue objects can outperform two F-16s, you know, right near D.C., post 9/11 America. I think that's a little bit interesting. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Could have been any number of things. It doesn't say what they could be. The other interesting thing about that article was that an anonymous Air Force person told the media that they were tracking this thing on radar, and then it just blipped off the radar. It was just gone. So whatever. So it continues on, never stops. And then a little over a year ago, a famous case that took place in Texas, little town of Stephenville. A bunch of people saw this immense object. One person described it. It was so big, it was described as a flying Walmart, which is the scariest of all things. When Walmarts fly, I'm gone, man. I'm out of here. Okay. But anyway, so it came over and then stopped, and then took off, and a bunch of F-16s were seen in pursuit. And in fact, we were able to get, I say we very loosely, it wasn't me, Angela Joyner, local reporter, and some other people were able to obtain FAA radar data about that. And the last bit of information they were able to get confirmed from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, was that this object was last seen going off in the direction of the Crawford Ranch, which was President Bush's retreat. It literally was going off in exactly that direction. And what we don't know is whether it continued over there, but it was going in that direction. So that's rather interesting, I should say. So a little bit of some of these confrontations. There's much, much more. There's really no need for me to go into a lot of detail for our purposes, except to say there's a great deal of documentation of military interest in these objects, many attempted interceptions, close encounters. There have been probable crash retrievals. One of the cases I mentioned previously, I didn't really discuss on the list, was a crash in Bolivia in 1978, for example. It's a very interesting case. Whether it's an alien craft or not, I couldn't tell you, but it's strange. It's very strange. And as I'll mention in a moment, there was actually, I think, a good amount of research done, starting a little bit leaks and so on in the 50s and 60s, but then in the 70s taking off, a lot of insiders talking about crash retrievals of UFOs that have gone down, not just Roswell, many, many. And so if that's true, and I think it is, so you've got that whole aspect going on. So in other words, a silent Cold War. Think of it that way. And so any disclosure or any openness on this topic is going to have to deal with this reality. And this let me just interject here, is the one issue of discomfort that I have with the thesis that an announcement about UFOs will be of an invasion will be a false flag operation. I mean, here's what I can certainly say on my own behalf, that any announcement that any government says on UFOs is going to be a lie. I will not ever believe it. And if Barack Obama tomorrow were to say we're being invaded by aliens, I would be very, very suspicious of anything he says. All right? But the fact is that there is a genuine history of confrontation, and indeed I would say hostility at some level between us and them. Okay. So any disclosure will have to answer, why are we chasing them? Fair question. So now we get into what I call the structure of secrecy, crash retrievals and money. Any secret that's important is going to be a secret that's worth money. So let's go back in time. Pretend that you're Harry Truman in the late 1940s, whenever the president might have been informed that, yes, sir, we have recovered technology that does not appear to have been manufactured by human hands, let's just say. Okay. So what would you do? Well, I think our first instinct would be, well, we have to tell the world. This is important. We can't hide it from humanity. But you might not. You might not. Not in 1947, let's say, when you have the beginnings of a Cold War, however you want to interpret the justness of the American side of it, okay, that's really irrelevant. You're running this country, this enormous multinational corporation called the United States, and are you going to tell the world that you've recovered this exotic technology when in fact you weren't even willing to share atomic technology with the world, which in 1947 was a very big issue. The United Nations was pounding at the door at the time saying, hey, atomic technology is so important, America, you need to share it and put it under United Nations control. America's answer was, no thank you, because they didn't want to share it. Okay, so I think it's likely that they wouldn't want to share something as exotic as alien technology. So you'd keep it secret. You might organize a group of top people around you of various disciplines. You say, your job is to figure out how bad the panic will be. Your job is to figure out who these other beings are. Your job is to figure out what we can do with this technology and make money off of it, and right, all of this.